Actually, let's just watch this now.
I mean, how do you feel about, factory farming, for example? How do you feel about the way that we get our food?
I would hate to say it's a somewhat necessary evil.
Necessary for what?
Feeding people. I would love to see maybe something more sustainable. I know crickets have been...
This guy looks like a fucking inbred midget. And then he's like, well, we need to eat meat for nutrients. How are we gonna get nutrients? Like, buddy, you're fucking 5'5". Your face looks like it's made out of fucking clay and somebody just did a rough fucking molding of somebody's face from memory. And you're weak as shit and you can barely do any fucking push-ups. And then he's like, how am I gonna grow big and strong and become a real boy if I don't eat meat? It's always those people, dude. Always.
I would love to see maybe of the same foods we're already eating, or less torturous. I mean, for example, in my country, over 80% of pigs that are reared for food are in gas chambers. Carbon dioxide, they're lowered in cages into chambers of carbon dioxide, where you can watch the footage of this online. It's not just putting them to sleep. Now, we do actually know that there are other gases we can use that would be less painful, that they wouldn't cause them to squeal around, choking on their own breath. Invisible gas as well, so they probably just only adds to the confusion. Just an unimaginable cruelty for these animals. Now, maybe it's the case that for whatever reason, we need to be pigs for food. We need bacon, we need it for whatever reason. If that's the case, which is dubious already, why don't we use another gas which is less painful? Well, because it's more expensive. Okay, so it's sort of like, when you say it's a necessary evil, it might be necessary to like animals for food. It might be necessary to rear maybe even lots of animals for food. And it may be necessary sometimes not to treat them ideally because of the amount of food that we need. But the current practices of factory farming are sort of beyond the pale.
So what do you think is a solution for that practice of farming?
Well,
is there one? Is it even possible to humanely breed and raise animals for farming?
Well, humane is a tricky word to use there because, of course, to the extent that you are unnecessarily an animal, it's difficult to describe that as humane. I certainly think that if the industry is going to change, I used to be a vegan, and I used to think that the solution to this was just to not eat the products, to not pay for the products. It's essentially a boycott. Boycotts work, at least sometimes.
But then I pooped my pants, and then I realized, oh, it's not that simple. We can't walk around with dirty diarrhea bottoms all day. We need some other solution than veganism because I have diarrhea poopy pants. What a fucking clown.
Boycotts can be effective. And for a time, veganism was really beginning to take off. It seemed like it was really changing the world, and you become really convinced that the world one day will actually be vegan, that morality will catch up on the world, and in the same way that all kind of other injustices like human slavery are abolished, the same thing will happen with animal exploitation. By the way, more human beings are in slavery today than were at the height of the transatlantic slave trade. It's just that at least now we condemn it and try to root it out. I'm just not convinced that's going to work anymore. And I don't think that people will stop eating animals. And I don't think that it's wrong in the way that I used to in principle, because you sort of, the big end of the funnel when it comes to veganism is factory farming footage. You show people, I talk just how I've spoken to you now about these abominable practices. And so you say, okay, I want to do something about this. And then maybe you become a vegan. And then there's a lot of debate about, well, what if we kill the animals in a different way? What if I've got backyard chicken farming? And there's a big discussion there. What if I've got chickens in my back garden? What if I eat their eggs? Can that be a problem?
What if I have children getting their soccer ball in my backyard garden? Can I cut off their fingers and eat them like little sausages? They're in my back garden. Fucking idiot.
And people will still say, well, okay, they've still been selectively bred to lay more eggs than they would naturally. which often gives them a calcium deficiency, which leads to things like osteoporosis in chickens, which is bad, but it's nowhere near as bad or as as much of an emergency as factory farming, right? And so suddenly you're having these much more sort of nuanced debates about animal ethics, about what you have the right to do, because you've first you've gotten through the door with the obvious stuff. The first thing we need to do is convince people of the obvious stuff. This is inexcusable. There's no excuse for the way that we are sort of treating pigs in factory farms at the moment. There's
Do girls not like...
no excuse. If this is the only way to produce bacon to the extent that we currently eat it, then eat less. Right? It's just not even close. It makes parody of ethics. The solution, I think, needs to be something like what happened with the environmentalist movement. You remember sort of 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, everybody's saying, make sure you switch off your lights, make sure you don't leave the tap running, because if you leave that running for a year, it can fill up an Olympic-sized swimming pool. And so you're sort of doing it a little bit. And then people begin to realize, actually, that's not really solving the problem. What we need to do is we need to go and like lobby Shell to stop whatever the hell it is that Shell do. We need to stop governments from investing in fuel licenses. We need to get universities to divest their investments in fossil fuel industries, for example. It's much more now about protesting authority and trying to make systematic change happening from the top down. And now the idea of the environmentalist whose principal focus is trying to convince people to remember to turn their lights off kind of seems almost a bit silly. It's like, really, like that's going to solve the problem? Well, maybe, yeah, sure. If everybody did that, maybe we'd have less of a problem. But the way to do this is clearly systematic top-down change. And I think the same thing maybe needs to happen with veganism. I'm not entirely sure about this. I'm open to be convinced either way. But I think that whereas people might have said, we just need to stop eating these products, maybe it's now actually, no, let's go and lobby the government to make this a criminal offense.
Now, how would that differ with crickets? Because let's just say one cow could feed 10 people versus 10,000 crickets feeding the same 10 people, and like 10,000 crickets and you kept in like, in their own filth and this and that. Like, how would it differ from the perspective of just suffering life?
It's going to depend on your view of like consciousness of crickets, right? Because intuitively, I want to say that a cow is worth much more than a cricket. Many more crickets are worth the same as a cow. But that's a very difficult thing to quantify. It's like when we actually try to put a number on it, it's impossible. Like, how many cows would you save one dog? Like, I don't know. Like 3.5. Like, who knows, right?
Yeah. The correct answer is 1.75.
Right. Yeah. I think that the cricket thing is interesting, right? Because what's the solution? If we're not eating cows, what if we're going to eat thousands of crickets? Well, look, why not let's start by like eating cows, but not rearing them on factory farms? How about that? Why don't we sort of try to create more organic ways of farming these animals, at least as a start, right? Like, in other words, there are not two options. If you really don't want to do away with the eating of animal products, it's not like your only options are forcing pigs into gas chambers or eating thousands of locusts. There's sort of a middle ground to be had there, right? And so what I'm saying here is, for a start at least, systematic governmental change. It should be a criminal offense to do all kinds of things that are currently legal. Because, by the way, the things I'm describing here are legal, right? And most factory farms aren't even following the regulations. Every single time somebody breaks in with a camera, puts a camera on the side of a factory farm and like exposes what's going on, it's so much worse. It's so much worse. And I'm describing what you can legally do. And that's if everybody's following the rules. People like Joey Carbstrong for years have been breaking into farms at, I suppose, quite considerable risk, and putting cameras on the side and showing people what happens. And it's not nice. And so at the very least, this kind of stuff should be a criminal offence. In the UK, you have to stun an animal before you can kill it. It's a legal requirement that you have to stun an animal before you kill it for food. Now, the UK government considers gas chambers to be a form of stunning at the same time, if you like, two birds with one stone, or two pigs in one gas chamber. And so this practice is allowed where, like, if the pig didn't die, that might well be illegal because you've just sort of gassed a pig and it hasn't died. And also if you just like that pig without stunning it, you'd have committed a criminal offense.
So how do you assign your value hierarchy to life?
I don't know. I don't have a good answer to that question because it, like, as I was alluding to a moment ago, it's very difficult to actually give an analysis of why things are valuable, right? Every time you try to do it, It's very difficult. So there's this argument called name the trait, which is used in the context of animal ethics, which is to say, give me the thing that's true of a pig or a cow, that if it were true of a human, you'd be okay with a human for food. Right? So people say, well, we kill animals because they're less intelligent than us. Okay, so we'll take a human being and make them less intelligent. Actually, Thomas Jefferson wrote about this.
This guy is not vegan because he's just selfish. I think he completely and utterly made up that pants shitting thing because this guy's a fucking dumbass and a pseudo-intellectual, and that was the best thing you could come
Excellent
up with.
burps.
Was responding to a review, I think, of a book that had been published around the time of the American Revolution about the intellectual and artistic achievements of black people. Somebody had written a book detailing all kinds of achievements that were done, that were made by black people. And I suppose the implication was to be like, look what people are capable of. You should think differently about black people. And Thomas Jefferson wrote a response to this and said, no one's happier than I am to see this kind of thing. But we should not fool ourselves into thinking that this is any indication of their worth. I mean, just because Isaac Newton was more intelligent than, my mother, does that mean that he has more of a right to life, to not be abused, to not be killed? No, of course not. And in other words, intelligence is not a metric to determine your moral worth. But if that's the case, then when somebody says, well, pigs are less intelligent than us, okay, so what? Okay, so what is it then? Is it, oh, well, pigs are...
Thanks for that.
Less self-aware. Okay, well, you can make a human less self-aware as well. Imagine a cognitively disabled human being. You can essentially start transforming a human being into a pig. Mm-hmm. You can give the human 4 legs. Is it okay to put him in a gas chamber now? No. Okay, well, let's lower the human's intelligence level. Definitely not. We definitely don't want to be putting people in gas chambers based on their intelligence level, do we? Okay, what if we give him a curly tail? How about now? No. Okay, but you're slowly turning this human into a pig. And you get to a point where that human is now identical to the pig. And yet you still are no, it's still not okay to put them in the gas chamber. But that's what we're doing over here to this identical creature, So it's actually very difficult to determine what...
That's very interesting.
It's the biggest challenge. But because one of the reasons it's such a big challenge is because on another level, a human is worth more than a pig. People just sort of intuitively know this. Now, I'm an emotivist about ethics. I think that when people make ethical judgments, they're just expressing emotions. And so I think it's got a lot to do with how many genes you share with people. And so I think that really it's got to do with how much that pig kind of resembles a human to you. That's going to determine how much you in fact value that pig. That's not a moral claim. That's not a justified. I think that's just what's happening. But if you start trying to say that, no, actually, I think that a pig is worth less than a human. And I think that a dog is worth more than a rat. And I ask you why. Whatever reason you give, all you've got to do is apply that to a human being and see if that's actually the reason, And a lot of...
Yeah, and the only reason he's not vegan is because he's just a selfish jackass.
Be able to say